Alright, hello, this is Victoria Little. I will be doing my presentation over the small intestines. The basic outline of this presentation will go over the small intestine's anatomy, the blood vessels and lymphatic vessels, innervation of the small intestines, the histology of the small intestines, the endocrinology, its musculature, and some common pathologies which can afflict the small intestines. Starting out with the anatomy, we can see that the small intestines is an organ which is situated in the GI tract. Specifically, it's located between the pyloric sphincter, which is part of the stomach, and the ileocecal valve, which opens into the colon or large intestines. Now, the small intestines is actually the main site where food is digested. There will be a lot of enzymes which are secreted by some cells of the small intestines, which help further break down the food that has been already kind of churned up and broken down by the acid in the stomach. The small intestines is contained within the peritoneum of the abdominal cavity. Now, the peritoneal cavity, where the small intestines is located, it's largely supported by the mesentery, which is kind of a fan-shaped structure. It allows the small intestines to move about a little bit, but it's anchored enough where the small intestines isn't going to be so loose that it'll become twisted or kinked, which would cause some pathology. The pancreatic duct is a structure which connects the small intestines to the pancreas. The pancreatic duct actually has secretions from the pancreas. It merges with the common bile duct, which receives bile secretions from the liver. They kind of combine to form the structure called the hepatopancreatic ampulla, otherwise known as the ampulla vator. This kind of pierces the wall of the duodenum, joins to the duodenum at a site called the duodenal papilla. And it's at the duodenal papilla where the bile and pancreatic juices actually enter the small intestines to aid in digestion. The small intestines in length is about 3 to 5 meters, and that's taking into account that in a living person these muscles will be somewhat contracted. In a cadaver, when the muscle wall is completely relaxed, you'll actually see that the small intestines can be even longer, as long as 12 feet in fact. Some characteristics of the small intestines: even though it is called the small intestines, it is in fact larger than the colon. The small part of its name actually refers to the fact that the small intestines is smaller in diameter than the colon, but because it's all coiled and tangled up and extremely long, it's actually a larger structure. The reason it's so long and narrow is to provide additional surface area for the food that's being digested to travel along. So it comes into more contact with the epithelial layer, which itself contains further surface area by all the finger-like projections called microvilli, which aid in digestion. So the more surface area there is to contact the nutrient molecules, the more efficiently carried out digestion will be. I think we've stated this a few times at the slide, but the small intestines is actually the longest portion of the GI tract. Moving on to the three main areas of the small intestines, we have the first area, which is the shortest and most proximal segment, called the duodenum. This connects to the stomach at the pyloric sphincter, and it contains the epithelial layers that contain finger-like projections called villi, which are important for digestion of nutrients moving through the digestive system. The next area, it would be blue here on this picture that we have in the slide, is the jejunum. There's the ligament of Treitz, which is the site of the division between the first part of the small intestines, the duodenum, and the jejunum. This layer of the epithelial layer of the jejunum will contain enterocytes, which are these cells that are really important for absorption of nutrients going through the GI tract, and it will also contain those villi projections. The ileum is the final segment of the small intestines, and it's also the longest. It terminates into the colon at the ileocecal valve. It will also contain villi. It also contains special structures called Peyer's patches, which we will go into later on in the PowerPoint. Moving on to the vessels of the small intestines. For its blood supply, the main arteries and veins we'll be looking at are the superior mesenteric and the inferior mesenteric, which are over here in blue on the giant picture. These will supply blood supply to the small intestine as well as the large intestines. The hepatic portal vein is actually the vein that supplies blood going towards the small intestines. I misspoke. The superior and inferior mesenteric arteries are the arteries which go to the small intestines. The nerves that are attached to the small intestines are the celiac ganglia as well as the vagus nerve, which is the wandering cranial nerve. The lymphatic vessels of the small intestines are the intestinal lymph trunk. Moving on to the histology, there are four main layers of the small intestines. There's the mucosa layer, which is the innermost layer closest to the lumen where the food will be traveling. It contains many of these villi projections, which are these kind of finger tentacle-like things that have increased surface area to go into contact with all the nutrients traveling along the alimentary canal. The mucosal layer is the site of absorption. It's also going to be a layer where we're secreting digestive enzymes and hormones to aid in digestion. Right below that, depicted in yellow on the slide, is the submucosal layer. It's a combination of dense irregular connective tissue and loose connective tissue, and basically anchors that mucosal layer to the smooth muscle of the muscularis propria. Muscularis propria is made up of two types of smooth muscle, circular muscle and longitudinal smooth muscle. And this is going to carry out peristalsis, which is that gut movement, kind of that groaning in your gut area that you can feel when your stomach, so to speak, is rumbling. The outermost layer would be the serosa, which is a smooth, thin layer of cells which secrete serous fluid and connective tissue as the layer on the serosa. Going into the histology of the mucosal layer in the duodenum specifically, we'll see that there are a bunch of different cell types in this layer. We have the enterocytes, which absorb peptides, fats, sugars, water, electrolytes, and bile salts. They're also able to secrete a hormone called leptin, which helps inhibit hunger, which kind of helps regulate energy expenditure of the body by making it not want to eat as much. Goblet cells we have to produce mucus and secrete that kind of helps with easing things along the GI tract. We also have Paneth cells, which are kind of a function of the innate immune system. They produce a bunch of granules that get in the way of microbial growth and also help modulate the innate immune system. So this helps keep our gut GI flora in check, keep all the good flora, bacteria, and whatever that we need in there, and kind of tamper down on potential pathogens. Intestinal glands or intestinal crypts, these are going to be the basal part of the mucosal layer. They contain stem cells which will keep projecting inwards towards the lumen as they grow, and eventually as they become epithelial, they will shed into the lumen within about a week generally. Enterocytes and goblet cells will also be contained within this epithelial lining. Moving on to the submucosal layer of the duodenum, the big difference in this layer is that we're going to have Brenner's glands, which are contained exclusively within the duodenum. Brenner's glands secrete this alkaline kind of mucus into the lumen of this small intestines. Now, it being alkaline for its pH is important because we have very acidic pH presently in the food going through the GI tract until the stage where it meets the small intestines, and that's because the stomach acid that was secreted in the stomach is obviously acidic to help break down a bunch of those important molecular interactions and the nutrients. So Brenner's glands are present only in the duodenum. You're not going to see them in the jejunum or the ileum. So it's important that they're at the very start of the small intestines where it connects from the stomach. Okay, going on to the histology of the jejunum, we're looking mostly at the mucosal layer here because every other layer of the jejunum is pretty similar to the rest of the small intestines. And the mucosa in the jejunum is actually quite similar to the same layer in the duodenum. You're still going to have the intestinal crypts, which push those stem cells further and further to the epithelial surface, still containing Paneth cells, goblet cells, and enterocytes. Okay, and you have those microvilli, of course, which are aiding in digestion. Okay, and histology of the ileum is what we're going to discuss in this slide, specifically the mucosal layer. The big difference for the ileum's mucosal layer is that the villi that we're seeing are actually a little bit shorter and a little bit broader. They also have these structures, which are outlined here in blue, called Peyer's patches. Now these are areas of lymphoid tissue within the lamina propria. You'll only find these Peyer patches in the ileum. We also have lacteals, which are lymphatic capillaries. They're these areas of white space depicted here on the photo. They're located within the cores of some of the villi, and they help secrete and absorb dietary. They absorb dietary fats that are going through the GI tract. This slide is kind of just a summary of the histology that we went over. The serosal layer, with the duodenum, you'll have that serosa in the first layer, with the second, fourth being adventitia, but it's normal within the jejunum and the ileum. For the muscularis layer, for all three of the areas of the small intestines, we're going to have that circle of circular muscle and longitudinal muscle. Submucosal layer, the only big difference is that the duodenum contains Brunner's glands, while the jejunum and ileum will lack these glands. As for the mucosal layer, the duodenum and the jejunum do not have Peyer's patches, but the ileum will have these Peyer patches. All of these different areas of the small intestines will contain those goblet cells secreting mucus, the Paneth cells of the innate immune system, and the enterocytes carrying out digestive secretions into the lumen. Just brushing on the endocrinology of the small intestines, we'll see that there are some secreted hormones and some digestive secretions. Regarding the hormones, we'll have secretin, which stimulates the pancreas to make this fluid that helps neutralize the stomach acid. We touched on that earlier with the duodenum. Then there's cholecystokinin, which stimulates the contraction of the gallbladder. This causes it to release bile, which will drain into the small intestines and help break down food that's traveling within the lumen. Then we have leptin, which we kind of talked about a little bit earlier. It signals the hypothalamus to actually inhibit the hunger stimulation in the brain. So this is caused this kind of causes satiation, which helps regulate energy expenditure. If you're not going to be expending a lot of energy, you don't really need to be eating that much. So leptin is a hormone which plays into that. Regarding digestive secretions, we have peptidase, which breaks down peptides further into amino acids. Sucrase will break down sucrose into its smaller monomer of glucose. Maltase will break down maltose into glucose, and lactase will break down lactose into glucose. Muscular of the small intestines really divides into those two layers that we touched on in the histology section, which will be the longitudinal layer of smooth muscle and the circular layer of smooth muscle. So we can see that the circular layer kind of has these overlapping long fibers, while the longitudinal layer has more of these cuboidal shaped cells. And they're kind of running at different angles to each other, we can see. It's a bit of a right angle where it intersects perpendicularly. Touching briefly on pathologies of the SI, we have a GI bleed. That would be a gastrointestinal hemorrhage that would take place specifically within the small intestines. Celiac disease, which is kind of an immune response whenever the person consumes gluten, which will damage the cells of the small intestines. Crohn's disease is kind of an unknown etiology of inflammation and erosion of the tissues of the GI tract. It can specifically affect the small intestines. A duodenal ulcer is a type of peptic ulcer, which is a sore that develops on the lining of the duodenum. This can be caused by the bacterium H. pylori or NSAIDs, kind of effing with the mucus lining. Which helps regulate stomach acid. So if the stomach acid is not neutralized, it can burn kind of a lesion into the duodenum surface. Obstruction of the small intestines is a blockage or obstruction which keeps food and liquid from passing through. This can actually lead to the death of the tissue where the bowel is obstructed. And then diverticulitis, this is seen more commonly in the large intestines but can affect the small intestines. And this is kind of like a small bulging sac that forms. Biblical verse I decided to use here is Genesis 1:29. I figured I'd include this because the small intestines is the major site of digestion. It's where most of the foods that we eat are actually absorbed and utilized to carry out the processes of metabolism. So I thought it was pretty relevant that. Here are the references for my slide, and that's my presentation. Thank you.